If there's one thing Yu-Gi-Oh players love, it's to compete at high-level tournaments. Everyone is racing to earn their spot at the World Championship, where they'll be able to take on the best players from all around the globe. But back in the early 2000s, this was far from the case. The game was still brand new, but Yu-Gi-Oh gained popularity with the competitive card game players extremely quickly. I mean, it does make sense. The game was built from the ground up for intense and epic anime battles between you and an opponent, so who wouldn't jump at the chance to earn the title of King of Games? Either way, it wasn't very long until Yu-Gi-Oh had its very own series of competitive tournaments, which could attract hundreds or even thousands of players. Winning a tournament has never just been for bragging rights, and all through Yu-Gi-Oh's history, different events have had all kinds of different prizes that you could win. And throughout all of these events, there was one series of tournaments that gave players the chance to earn the greatest prize imaginable: exclusive Yu-Gi-Oh prize cards. These prize cards had extremely powerful effects, and despite not seeing a widespread release for many years, were completely legal for competitive play. Winning one of these events gave you the chance to add an incredibly strong card to your deck that only other championship winners had access to. And if that sounds crazy, that's because it is. Imagine how in the anime, Kaiba's the only one to have access to the Blue Eyes White Dragon, but in this case, it was for actual real-life tournaments. So today we'll be looking at the card that won a grand finals match in under 10 minutes. A card so powerful it caused the first ever emergency update to the Forbidden and Limited list. This is the story of the first ever exclusive prize card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Cyber-Stein. Let's take a trip back to 2004. The physical game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was only 2 years old in the West and was rapidly increasing in popularity. But even with Yu-Gi-Oh! On everyone's mind, as far as organized play went, let's just say your best chance at getting some games in was to show up at the playground and hope someone else had a deck ready to go. The largest tournaments at the time were actually held at Toys R Us locations throughout North America. So if that doesn't give you an idea of how rough the competitive community had it back in the day, I don't know what will. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always been lovingly referred to as a children's card game, so it may not sound like a competitive scene is the most important thing for the game's success, but that couldn't be further from the truth. High-level competition and prizing gives players a reason to continually buy into the products as they're released, and also just invest more of their time. So eventually, the original distributor of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Upper Deck, had no choice but to make some moves to maximize their sales. Upper Deck created an official Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament circuit in collaboration with the original publisher of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, known as the Shonen Jump Championship series. The SJC events were the first ever large-scale, officially supported Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments that the game had ever seen, and they were hosted throughout Canada and the US starting in late 2004. Sorry to all my European duelists out there, but I'm just covering the facts. This was it. There was finally a reason for players to be rewarded for their dedication to the game and take it extremely seriously. And take it seriously, they certainly did. The first ever SJC was hosted on December 4th and 5th of 2004 in Anaheim, California. 309 passionate Yu-Gi-Oh! Players all faced off in a 9-round tournament, each of them eyeing the prizes that awaited the top 8 duelists of the day. Everyone in the top 8 would receive booster packs, playmats, video games, and an invite to the national tournament where they would be able to compete for their chance to play in the World Championship. There was also brand new Nintendo DS's, PS2 Slims, and for first place, well, it's not hard to guess, the entire reason for this video is for the first place prize. First place got a gaming laptop from Dell, a sheet of Ultimate Rares from the latest set, Rise of Destiny, a championship trophy, and of course, the first ever and completely exclusive English language copy of the prize card, Cyber-Stein. So as cool as a gaming laptop from 2004 is, with its gigantic 1 GB of DDR1 RAM, let's take a closer look at Yu-Gi-Oh's Frankenstein monster. Cyber-Stein is a level 2 Dark Machine type monster with 700 attack and 500 defense. The potential it has though comes in its powerful effect. Pay 5,000 life points to special summon a fusion monster from your fusion deck in attack position. On first glance, you might think this effect has a pretty steep cost, and you'd be right. Paying over half of your starting 8,000 life points to special summon a fusion monster shouldn't be taken lightly. But if summoning that monster wins you the game, it doesn't really matter how much life you pay, does it? Well, with that being the case, we should probably take a look at what the state of the fusion deck was like in 2004. And I can start by mentioning that back in the day, fusion monsters were the only type of monster in the extra deck before synchros were introduced, so it was just called the fusion deck. There also wasn't any size limit to the fusion deck at the time, so you could really play any fusion monsters that you were able to get your hands onto. The moral of this story is, even though you had an entire second deck with infinite cards in it, entirely dedicated to fusion summoning alone, the mechanic was still really, really bad. At the time, we didn't have a bunch of fusion monsters with generic materials or crazy overloaded spell cards that let us fusion summon from wherever we wanted to. If we wanted to fusion summon in 2004, we needed at least 2 specifically named monsters and the good old-fashioned polymerization. And that's not even to mention if you even knew how to fusion summon, because polymerization didn't even explain what it actually did. The card text at the time basically just told you to go read the rulebook, where it had an entire 2 pages dedicated to its effect alone. To say it was the most complicated mechanic in the game at the time would be a massive understatement, and to say it was the worst mechanic in the game at the time would be far too generous. Most of the fusions at the time were just a combination of 2 random weak vanilla monsters, and in most cases, the fusion monster you were summoning was barely stronger than one of the 2 materials anyway. Seriously, someone please explain to me why you would ever want to summon Fusionist. So it's clear early fusion summoning left a lot to be desired, but maybe now with Cyber-Stein, that could be different. Suddenly you didn't have to worry about the massive loss in card advantage in order to bring out the strongest fusion you could find. And yes, 5,000 life points is a lot, but as long as you have 1 life point left, that's all you need in order to secure the win. So what powerful fusion monsters were around for Cyber-Stein to take advantage of when it was given out as a prize card for the first SJC? The main contender was Thousand Eyes Restrict. This is a level 1 fusion that allows you to remove one of your opponent's monsters by turning it into an equipped spell, as well as stopping all other monsters from attacking or changing their battle positions. It was removal plus a floodgate, so it was by far the best the fusion deck had to offer at the time. There was also a couple other strong fusion monsters though, like Dark Paladin. A combination between the iconic Dark Magician and Buster Blader, this card lets you discard cards to negate spell card activations, which is a really strong effect. Oh, wait. Yeah, you see how the first line of Dark Paladin's effect is must be fusion summoned? That means Cyber-Stein isn't actually able to bring him out, since Cyber-Stein's effect doesn't count as a fusion summon. That's really too bad, because Dark Paladin is a really good card. The next best choice for spell negation was Dark Balter the Terrible. It had much less attack, and it also required you to pay 1,000 life points to negate the spells instead of just discarding cards. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be too bad, but after paying 5,000 to get him out in the first place, suddenly your opponent doesn't really have to do much before you just end up dying on your own. Ryo Senshi was another cool choice that had the same sort of negation effect but for trap cards, but was also protected from being targeted by spell cards. Sadly, the life point cost caused the same problem here. So at the end of the day, your best option, other than Thousand Eyes Restrict, was just to grab a Black Skull Dragon with 3,200 attack and start hitting your opponent as hard as you could. Is that good? Yeah, not really. As it turns out, Cyber-Stein was actually pretty weak upon its initial release. It was given out as a prize card for every SJC event from December 2004 to July 2005, and during that time, it didn't really see any play at all. The overall drive for the community to experiment and deck build with Cyber-Stein was just at an all-time low, and that's for 2 main reasons. Number 1, there was only 18 copies of the card given out all over North America, so 18 players had access to the card and nobody else. And number 2, well, I've sort of been hiding something from you. I haven't mentioned it until now, but there were already cards in the game that were much better at cheating out fusion monsters. Specifically, players were loving using the Magical Scientist monster card and the Metamorphosis spell card. Magical Scientists have been in the game since 2003, and it had a very similar effect to Cyber-Stein, but with a few more restrictions. The fusion monster you summoned had to be level 6 or lower, couldn't attack directly, and it was destroyed during the end phase. But on the bright side, you only had to pay 1,000 life points to activate the effect. And that part is really, really important. Because the cost for using the effect is so much lower, you could actually use it multiple times in a row to fill your field with powerful fusion monsters and end the game as quickly as possible. The ideal scenario would be to finish off your opponent before all your monsters die during the end phase, and that way you didn't have to worry about the card's downside. But with them being unable to attack directly, players had to get a little more creative. And thus, the Magical Scientist one-turn kill deck was born, in combination with the card called Catapult Turtle. This would allow you to tribute the fusion monsters you summon in order to deal direct damage to your opponent equal to half of their attack points. Using this combo, you could easily deal over 8,000 damage in a single turn. You just had to make sure the fusion monsters you were summoning had more than 2,000 attack. That way, the damage your opponent was taking would be outpacing the 1,000 damage you were taking from your own magical scientist. Oh yeah, and unlike attacking directly, you could do this on the very first turn if you had all the cards you needed. So before your opponent even had a chance to play a single card, they would lose the game. That's fun, right? And thus the Magical Scientist FTK, or First Turn Kill deck, was born. And helping it along its way was the spell card Metamorphosis. This card was even easier to use than Magical Scientist was, and just sent any monster on your field to the graveyard to summon a fusion monster of the same level from your fusion deck. You know, the whole point of fusion summoning, you take two different monsters and a spell card and you combine them all together to make something new. What if we didn't do any of that? So remember how I said Thousand Eyes Restrict is level 1 and one of the best fusion monsters in the game? Guess what level Magical Scientist is? Of course this just works. So if you got to the end of your Catapult Turtle combo and realized you were too low on life points, you could convert your Magical Scientist into a Thousand Eyes Restrict using Metamorphosis, steal your opponent's monster, and then tribute your Thousand Eyes Restrict with the attack boost in order to finish the game. And even without that combo, Metamorphosis was just a good card. You could even use it with stuff like Change of Heart to take your opponent's monster and convert it into a fusion that you would get to keep permanently. These cards were just extremely strong and would help to turn any duel into your favor if you played them. So compare them to Cyber-Stein, they had less downside, were more versatile, and more readily available to all the players. There really just was no reason to play Cyber-Stein in the current format. Though the effect is flashy and exciting, and it tries to tempt you with its unrestricted access to the extra deck, Cyber-Stein just wasn't quite powerful enough to see the spotlight of competitive play. At least, not yet. Just as any last hopes of a Cyber-Stein strategy were starting to fade, a few short weeks after the last one was handed out as a prize card in June of 2005, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Landscape started to shift, and as a surprise to everyone, players were about to dig deeper into finding the unrealized potential of the no longer exclusive Cyber-Stein. Dark Beginnings 2 released shortly after SJC Seattle in July of 2005. This pack contained reprints of cards from the last few sets and lower rarities for players who may have missed them. And to everyone's surprise, one of those cards was the first ever mass-produced printing of Cyber-Stein. After more than 7 months of competitive SJC events, the entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Community would finally have the chance to pull a Cyber-Stein from a regular pack in the low rarity of, well, rare. Don't mind the name, they're actually really easy to get. Suddenly, Cyber-Stein was widely available to everyone, and getting 3 copies of it to put in a deck would no longer cost you $30,000. So that's good. And although Cyber-Stein may have been severely outclassed when it was given out in the first half of 2005, there was one major change in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! That made all the difference for our square-headed friend. Magical Scientist had been banned. The Forbidden and Limited list was updated in April of 2005, and it saw the end of Magical Scientist's reign over the metagame, along with a couple other super oppressive cards like Painful Choice, the Forceful Sentry, and Confiscation. Metamorphosis was still available at 3 copies, but with its best level 1 target gone, it was not nearly as much of a problem as it was before. That and the April list also banned Change of Heart, which meant players had to rely on worse versions of the card like Enemy Controller or Brain Control. It was still great value to take your opponent's stuff and turn it into a fusion, but either way, things had never looked better for a Cyber-Stein revolution. And this only continued. When 1 month after Cyber-Stein's widespread release, the TCG saw even more reasons to play this card. On August 6, 2005, the brand new set Cybernetic Revolution gave even more support to a Cyber-Stein strategy. It contained the 2 strongest fusion monsters in the game thus far: Cyber Twin Dragon and Cyber End Dragon. Twin Dragon could attack twice in each battle phase and had a very respectable 2800 attack, and Cyber End Dragon had a gigantic 4000 attack and dealt piercing damage if it attacked through a defense position monster. We've certainly come a long way from Fusionist, haven't we? Suddenly all the pieces were coming together to make an entire deck based around winning with a flashy Cyber-Stein combo. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next few weeks, a dedicated Cyber-Stein deck began to show up at more and more events, its main strategy being to use floodgate type cards to slow your opponent down until you could get to your main combo. Things like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind were perfect to stop your opponent's monsters from attacking, and cards like Sangan were perfect for getting Cyber-Stein to your hand as quickly as possible. Last Will was also a great card for this strategy. A crazy old school card that could summon Cyber-Stein straight out of your deck as long as another one of your monsters had been sent to the graveyard that turn. All of these cards work together perfectly to make sure you would eventually get your Cyber-Stein to your field, clear the way with something like a giant Trunade, and make your opponent defenseless so you could swing in for a full 8,000 damage. But how would you get to the full 8,000 damage? Neither of these cards are capable of doing that on their own. Well, let's throw some more combo pieces into the mix. Megamorph is an equipped spell that halves a monster's attack if you have more life points than your opponent, or doubles a monster's attack if you have less life points than your opponent. This card was perfect for Cyber-Stein because it was all but guaranteed to double your monster's attack since you just paid 5,000 life points to summon one of the Cyber Dragons anyway. Cyber End Dragon at 8,000 or Cyber Twin Dragon attacking twice with 5,600 was usually enough to secure the game. But just in case that wasn't quite enough, there was also cards like United We Stand, which gave you 800 extra attack for every monster on your field. And just in case, as one more layer of security, you also had Limiter Removal, which would double all your machine type monsters attack until the end of the turn when they would be destroyed. But just like with Magical Scientists, that doesn't really matter if your opponent is already dead. So we finally have a dedicated Cyber-Stein strategy. But even outside of that deck, tons of other decks were using a small Cyber-Stein package just to represent a ton of damage in a single turn as an alternate win condition. Basically every deck that could play Cyber-Stein was playing Cyber-Stein at this point. And as for how the dedicated one-turn kill strategy performed, well, there's actually a specific deck that stopped a dedicated Cyber-Stein strategy from being a very popular choice among players. A very strong and very popular deck that completely counteracted everything that Cyber-Stein was trying to do. You see, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of complicated mechanics, but winning a game is actually pretty straightforward. All you have to do is reduce your opponent's life points to 0. This is most commonly done with monster attacks on the field, but it can also be combined with direct damage from spell and trap cards that hit your opponent with no monsters involved. Usually the course of a normal duel will involve using both of these types of damage in some varying combination in order to finish your opponent off. But in 2005, there was a perfect storm of cards available that allowed players to build a deck that could finish their opponent by only using damage from their spells and traps. And this deck was known as Chainburn. Chainburn was a deck that was filled with direct damage spells and traps that just had big enough numbers on them they could finish their opponent off within a couple of turns. It wasn't uncommon for someone to set 5 spells and traps against you and you would take half of your life as damage on the very first turn. Highlights include Secret Barrel, which dealt damage to your opponent based on how many cards they had on their field or in their hand, and Poison of the Old Man, which dealt 800 damage as a quick play spell and even had the option to heal you for 1200 if you needed it in a pinch. There was also a couple combos in the deck, like Ojama Trio, which summoned 3 useless Ojama tokens for your opponent, and Just Desserts, which dealt 500 damage to your opponent for every monster on their field. These cards combined for an easy 1500 damage, and probably 500 more if your opponent decided to summon a monster of their own. Then there's the namesake of the deck, Chain Strike. This card deals 400 damage to your opponent for every card in the chain when you use it. And with all these direct damage trap cards and quick play spells that you could use literally anytime you wanted, you could easily get up to Chain Link 5 or 6 for 2,000 or more damage. Draw some extra cards with Reckless Greed and reset your hand with Morphing Jar, and it shouldn't be too long before you're easily able to deal more than 8,000 damage. But you know what would make it even easier to deal 8,000 damage? What if your opponent's entire strategy was built around dealing 5,000 damage to themselves? Yeah, this matchup was obviously a huge problem for the Cyber-Stein deck. Even if you did somehow manage to get to your combo, there was almost no chance you would have 5,000 life points to pay in order to use its effect. So with Chainburn being as popular, easy, and cheap to build as it was, playing a dedicated Cyber-Stein deck in 2005 was just asking for trouble. But over the next year, through all the dark times, with Chainburn being as popular as it was, and every other player giving up on Cyber-Stein even being possible as a dedicated strategy, there was one brave soul who was dedicated enough to give Cyber-Stein the best run of its competitive career. It all came to a head December 16th, 2006 at the Shonen Jump Championship in San Jose. This is David Rodriguez. He had made it all the way to the top 8 of San Jose's SJC, repping his favorite Cyber-Stein OTK deck. And although he'd managed to avoid most of the Chainburn players so far, there were now 2 of them in the top 8 with him. The rest of the top 8 was variations on tempo-based Monarch decks that he hopefully wouldn't have many problems with. But for now, he had bigger fish to fry. As fate would have it, for his first top 8 match, he was against one of the 2 Chainburn players, Jeffrey Fizicaro. This was going to be extremely tough. On his very first turn, Jeffrey confidently set 5 spells or traps and passed it over to David. David knew he was already in trouble, but thankfully, he had some sort of a plan. He decided to summon his ever-faithful Nimble Mamanga, which is normally able to summon copies of itself when it dies and gain you a pretty substantial 3,000 life between its 3 copies. But that was not the strategy this time. All that mattered was attacking for as much damage as he possibly could. But sadly, before that, we got to see why Chainburn gets its name. Jeffrey activated Poison of the Old Man, followed by Secret Barrel, Reckless Greed, a second Secret Barrel, and then finally Chain Strike. In a gigantic 5 chain link combo, and on the first real action of the game, Jeffrey had already dealt damage to David for almost all of his life points. I guess now you can really see why the chances of getting Cyber-Stein's effect off in this matchup are basically 0. At the very least, David was able to equip his Nimble Mamanga with Megamorph to double its attack and attack for 2,000 damage. Then, on his next turn, Jeffrey set one monster face down and passed it back to David. He was able to summon an Exiled Force and tribute itself to get rid of the set Sangan. Jeffrey added Morphing Jar to his hand, and David dealt another 2,000 damage. Then, after drawing for his turn, Jeffrey realized his efforts were completely in vain, and he decided to concede the game and move on to game 2. And just like that, Cyber-Stein actually had a win over Chainburn. How did that happen? The players quickly went through their side decks before they started with game 2. In competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, you have a side deck of 15 cards that you're allowed to change with cards in your deck between each game of the best of 3 match. This is done to give you an edge over your opponent and adjust your deck strategy once you know what deck you're playing against. But sadly, this didn't really help David much in the second game. Although Jeffrey didn't get an insane turn 1 combo like he did before, he was much better able to execute his game plan of stopping David from doing whatever he wanted. Setting a Nimble Mamanga to try and get it destroyed and gain some life? Jeffrey didn't declare a single attack. Want to play out as many monsters as possible and push for damage? Ojama Trio blocked 3 of his zones with useless tokens. Want to attack with the few monsters you do have? Well, Threatening Roar stops all attacks for the turn. Oh yeah, and while all your monster zones are full, how about Adjust Desserts for 2,500 damage to finish the game? It was pretty clear the first game had just been a stroke of luck. David didn't stand much of a chance of breaking through Jeffrey's defensive strategy at all. And if he wanted to win this match, he would have to have an entirely new approach going into the third game. And thankfully, what David did next managed to shock every single audience member of this top 8 feature match. The third game began with David going first. He set a monster face down and 2 spell or trap cards, then passed his turn over to Jeffrey. Jeffrey started things off with a Graceful Charity before setting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spells or traps, and then summoning out a Sangan. With no cards left in his hand, Jeffrey was going all out. He attacked into Jeffrey's face down monster, which was a Stealth Bird? Wait a minute, this card deals 1,000 damage when it's flip summoned. This reads like a... Is this a burn card? David's face lit up the room. He started his turn by using Stealth Bird's effect to flip itself face down, and then flip summoned it to deal 1,000 damage. Then he activated a spell card, Wave Motion Cannon. This card gains counters every standby phase, and then can destroy itself to deal 1,000 damage for every counter on it? Okay, Stealth Bird may have some argument to be made to be included in other decks, but Wave Motion Cannon is purely a burn card. What is going on? As it turns out, David had one last trick up his sleeve. If you can't beat the Chainburn decks, it must be time to join them. David came to the SJC event prepared for the one impossible matchup that he was likely to face, and decided to fill his side deck with burn cards of his own. By siding out all of the Cyber-Stein combo pieces that he knew he was never going to be able to use anyway, and siding in burn cards, he was simply going to try to push for damage faster than his opponent did. It would certainly be close, but it was the best chance he had. Jeffrey started his turn with a Reckless Greed and Jar of Greed to draw 3 additional cards, then dealt 1600 damage with 2 Poison of the Old Man. Desperate to slow down the damage clock, Jeffrey tried to swing into the Stealth Bird that was now in attack position, but David had just the thing. Ring of Destruction. This destroyed the Sangan and dealt 1000 damage to both players. Jeffrey got his Morphing Jar from his deck, set it and 3 other cards face down, and passed the turn. David drew for his turn and immediately got hit by Jeffrey's Ojama Trio. 1 tick onto the Wave Motion Cannon and 1000 more damage from the Stealth Bird had Jeffrey looking pretty worried. David once again summoned a Nimble Mamanga and attacked the Morphing Jar, giving them both 5 new cards from their deck. Then, it was time for the final push. David set 3 cards face down and passed the turn to Jeffrey. And when his turn began, David activated Poison of the Old Man. With no response, he activated a second copy, representing 1600 damage. Jeffrey decided to respond with just desserts. And then, David was able to use the best card after a Morphing Jar goes off, Secret Barrel. 200 damage for every card Jeffrey had on his field and in his hand would be enough to finish the game. Jeffrey was able to respond with a Secret Barrel of his own, but by then, it was too late. The chain began resolving backwards, and with it, the rest of Jeffrey's life points disappeared. David had done the impossible and beaten Chainburn at its own game. And by doing so, paved the way to show what Cyber-Stein could really do. With Chainburn out of the way, it was smooth sailing until the finals, where, funnily enough, David was actually slated to face off against his friend and teammate, Mario Mateo. Effectively claiming the event as co-champions together, they still wanted to play out the game and decide who the real king of games was. And with Mario winning the die roll, things could have gone bad pretty quickly. Thankfully, luck was on David's side as Mario began the game by setting 1 Speller Trap and passing his turn. David summoned out Sangan and attacked for 1000 damage before setting 2 cards of his own. Mario had completely bricked. He had no cards to play at all, so he just set another spell and trap and passed the turn back. In his end phase though, David decided to use Ring of Destruction on his own Sangan, dealing 1000 to both players and letting him get Cyber-Stein from his deck to his hand. Then once his turn started, he was able to use Giant Trunade to remove Mario's spells and traps, summon Cyber-Stein, pay 5000, and get a Cyber End Dragon that could attack for 8000 thanks to limiter removal. They quickly moved on to the second game of the match, which started much the same way. Mario set a Speller Trap and a monster and passed his turn. David looked down at his hand, thinking for a moment before he finally looked up, smiled, and just said, "Sorry, Mario." He activated Giant Trunade again, summoned out Cyber-Stein, paid 5000 for Cyber End Dragon, then equipped it with Megamorph and United We Stand. David had a 9600 attack point Cyber End Dragon that dealt piercing damage through defense position. And just like that, he was able to win the game and the match to become the San Jose SJC champion. After taking only 3 turns and less than 10 minutes on the match clock, David was able to win the entire SJC event with Cyber-Stein OTK. This undeniably proved that Cyber-Stein was a viable, dedicated strategy for a deck, and this placement would inspire players to try Cyber-Stein on their own for years to come. Well, at least it would have. You see, Upper Deck had spent a lot of time and money on creating the Shonen Jump Championship series, so to see their grand final match reduced to the mockery of less than 20 cards hitting the table didn't exactly make them jump for joy. So with the fear that Cyber-Stein mirror matches that only last 2 minutes would become the norm for SJCs going forward, Upper Deck did the unthinkable by adding Cyber-Stein to the Forbidden and Limited list a week after the event on December 21st, 2006. This was completely unheard of in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden and Limited list updates came in March and September of every year with no exception. The updates to the list always included tons of changes to keep the game feeling fresh and balanced, so the idea that they would do an update just to ban one specific card? It was ridiculous. I guess it just goes to show how worried they were for the future of the game if Cyber-Stein did manage to stick around for the next couple of months. And though I personally think it's a bit premature for them to have banned the card when it was just hitting its competitive stride, overall, for the health of the game, it's probably a good card to keep banned. Fusion monsters were always intended to be a combination of 2 monsters to create something new. And if there's any card in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! That shows us why that should always be the case, that card was Cyber-Stein. Thanks for watching.